get going. Hello and welcome. Thanks for coming out. My name is Mark Anderlich. I'm president of the Missoula Area Central Labor Council, which is a coalition of unions here in the Missoula area, and we're the AFL-CIO here in this area. So today, as you know, we have a whole host of workshops about organizing for power. This one at noon here is understanding the appeal of Trump's rhetoric and / use rhetoric to win. And we have three distinguished
underline that.
No, see, the witty repartee is already starting. I'm just trying to give them some boost here. We have Dr. Sarah Hayden, Dr. Joel Iverson, right, and Dr. Steve Schwartz, all from the University of Montana Communications Department, and they're going to lead us through what they make of the Trump campaign and the rhetoric used, and help us give us some tools for us to use in our work. So take it away. Thank you.
Right.
Oh, by the way, there's if you want, there's a sign-up sheet going around. Feel free. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all for being here. I have to say, well, first of all, can you all hear me?
Louder would be better.
Okay, I'll try to do my best. I tend to have okay, I'm a communication studies person with a quiet voice. I really appreciate you being here, but I have to tell you that on the morning of November 8th, there's no way in the world I thought I would be here giving this talk, right? Like everyone, I assumed, I believed that all the polls told me that Hillary Clinton was going to win. I was wrong, we were wrong, and so what my colleagues and I want to do, first of all, is talk a little bit about what happened, right? What did we miss? And so the title of my portion of the talk is Persuasive Fallacies, the Dangerous Rhetoric of Donald Trump. Before I get to the idea that he won, I want to talk about why he shouldn't have. There's so many reasons, right, that we thought that he wasn't going to win. I mean, we can start with the fact that he has no political experience. He is the first president, and I'm sorry to say I have to use that word now and not president-elect. He is now our first president to have been elected without any political experience before, without at least military experience, unless you want to talk about his birther campaign as political experience. He has a really problematic business history, right? We all know about all of his bankruptcies. We know about how poorly he treated the people who contracted for his bankrupt businesses, right? So this horrible business history. His gaffes seem to come every day, from lewd remarks about women to making fun of racial minorities to making fun of a disabled reporter, right? I mean, this is beyond the pale. We would not have expected, I mean, we punish our 5-year-olds for behavior like this. And finally, he constantly uses fallacious arguments, arguments that are based not in truth, but in mistaken belief and faulty logic. And that's going to be most of what I'm going to be talking about. But first, I have to talk more about, some of the other things he does really poorly. And by the way, I've got a lot of clips of Trump, for which I apologize. It was not fun finding them either. But one of the things he does is he mixes his metaphors constantly. Now, you might think that it's just your English teachers who told you not to mix metaphors, but there's a good reason not to do it. In fact, political rhetoric will tell us that one of the most persuasive things a politician can do is use a good central metaphor. Ronald Reagan was excellent at this. He would talk about America as the shining city on the hill, and that metaphor provides sort of this a framework through which we can understand the different pieces of what he has to tell us. Trump is going to mix his metaphors consistently. So let me give you an example.
We have a $500 billion deficit, trade deficit with China. We're going to turn it around, and we have the cards. Don't forget, we're like the piggy bank that's being robbed. We have the cards. We have a lot of power with China. When China doesn't want to fix the problem in North Korea, we say, sorry, folks, you got to fix the problem. Because we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest step in the history of the world.
Okay, so we have a piggy bank, we have a card game, we have a rape, right? These things do not go together. They should create cognitive dissonance, not sort of a sense of power here. Hillary Clinton would talk about Trump as dangerously incoherent. She said what he offered was a series of bizarre rants, and indeed I think that's true. I call this rhetorically gobbledygook. I'm gonna coin that phrase.
Having nuclear, my uncle was a great professor and scientist and engineer, Dr. John Trump at MIT. Good genes, very good genes, okay? Very smart. The Wharton School of Finance, very good, very smart. You know, if you're a conservative Republican, if I were a liberal,
Okay, so we all have moments of disfluency, but his were so common. For all of these reasons, I mean, no wonder on November 8th we were all ready to celebrate, right? I don't know about you, I was in Ireland at the time, we had a bottle of Irish whiskey, right? We were gonna be drinking to Hillary. Instead we mourned, which you also can do with Irish whiskey. Powers was our favorite.
So you drank it for other reasons?
Yeah, we drank it as a mourning to get over our horror at what had happened. So he shouldn't have won. I'm going to talk a little bit about why perhaps he did win. And this work that I'm going to be talking about comes from the work of Jennifer Murcia. Dr. Murcia is a professor of communication studies at A&M University down in Texas. She's working on a book right now. The title of her book is The Rhetorical Brilliance of Donald Trump, Demagogue for President. It's coming out in the fall of this year. If you're interested and want to know more about what she has to say before the fall, just Google her. She's done, not surprisingly, a lot of press interviews recently, and a lot of her ideas about what's going on are out there in the public sphere. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, sort of what she has to say. And like Jennifer, I think she's absolutely right that Trump is a demagogue. So let's talk about what it means to be a demagogue. A demagogue is a person who capitalizes on popular prejudices. And Trump was brilliant at this, right? He was really able to, so sadly, sort of appeal to the worst of our nature. All those things, all of those ways in which we are not a united country. A demagogue makes false claims and promises, from the wall to repealing and replacing Obamacare with something that's going to be better and cheaper. And a demagogue uses arguments based in emotion rather than reason. Typically, a demagogue is not that persuasive, or not always persuasive. One of the reasons Trump was persuasive using this demagoguery had to do with the political climate. As we all know, right now we're facing historic levels of polarization. There are a lot of reasons for that, including a lot of bad behavior by politicians in Washington. But I think one of the biggest reasons has to do with the fractured media. Not that long ago, decades ago, when we wanted to know what was going on in the world, we tuned into ABC, CBS, or NBC. And we all got pretty much the same story, right? We all were on the same page in terms of what was going on. But what we have now are these media silos where we can go and simply listen to opinions and ideas that reflect back at us what we already believe. And we don't have to listen to one another across media environments, right? If you're an MSNBC person, you don't necessarily go to Fox. If you're a Fox person, you don't necessarily go to MSNBC. And frankly, those are the responsible media sources these days, right? There are many, many, many worse. In addition to a fractured media, we've got a really weak party system right now, and this has to do with both the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats were not able to control Bernie Sanders, which I thought was a good thing. The Republicans, even more so, were not able to control Donald Trump, right? So he's able to say things that are beyond the pale. And finally, we have a disaffected and distrustful electorate. A group of people who don't necessarily believe anymore in the political process. And this is particularly the white working class population. I'll talk about more of that in a little bit. Okay. So given this climate, why is it, or what does he do to engage in this demagoguery that is persuasive to at least a portion of the population? One of the things he does is he tells us that we are a nation in crisis. And this comes from one of his campaign commercials.
Trump, and I approve this message. The politicians can pretend it's something else, but Donald Trump calls it radical Islamic terrorism. That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on. He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil. And he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
We will make America great again.
Okay, so he tells us again that we are a nation in crisis, and he used a lot of, or his whoever put the commercial together, used a lot of really interesting techniques there, from the way in which they use color and black and white, from the timbre of the person who's speaking, to the really important grammar of the radical Islamic terrorists. One of the things that does, it wraps the word Islam or Islamic with these two negative terms, right? And Trump repeats this all the time, so that whenever we think of Islam, one of our biggest enemies, he's going to say, I don't believe that, but he's going to say, it's our biggest enemy because all Islamics are radical and terrorists. So he tells us we're a nation in crisis. He's also then, he targets his population. I said a moment ago that there's this disaffected, distrustful group of people, the white working class. But the white working class don't necessarily think of themselves as linked together as a group. They don't necessarily identify with themselves, with one another as a group until a rhetor, a speaker, someone like Donald Trump, tells them that they are in fact a group with common interests.
Every day, I wake up determined to deliver a better life for the people all across this nation that have been ignored, neglected, and abandoned. I have visited the laid-off factory workers and the communities crushed by our horrible and unfair trade deals. These are the forgotten men and women of our country, and they are forgotten, but they're not going to be forgotten long.
Okay, so he creates this sense of group, right? Identity amongst people who hadn't necessarily thought of themselves as a group before. And what's really interesting about what he did, typically when we think about identity politics, we think about racial minorities, African Americans or Hispanics. We think about the LGBTQ community. We think about women. What Trump did was he appealed to identity politics by talking about the white working class as members of a group, okay? Normally, white men, right, they're the background, they're the norm, but suddenly, this is a special interest group. Trump reinforces that through his us versus them rhetoric. This is a relatively long clip, but I think it's important.
But we don't have them. When was the last time anybody saw us beating, let's say, China in a trade deal? They kill us. I beat China all the time. All the time. When did we beat Japan at anything? They send their cars over by the millions. And what do? When was the last time you saw a Chevrolet in Tokyo? It doesn't exist, folks. They beat us all the time. When do we beat Mexico at the border? They're laughing at us, at our stupidity. And now they're beating us economically. They are not our friend, believe me. But they're killing us economically. The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. Thank you. It's true. And these are the best and the finest. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting. And it only makes common sense. It only makes common sense.
Okay, so there's a rhetorical theorist from the 20th century who talks about identification and creating groups, a sense of groupness within people. And he'll tell us that one of the best ways to create a sense of groupness in people is to scapegoat, right? To engage in that us versus them rhetoric. And look at all of the enemies we have, according to Donald Trump. We have enemies who are, sending cars to the United States, but not accepting our cars in their countries. We have Mexicans who are rapists and murderers and drug dealers. And those people, those bad people, they're different from us. They're not like you and you, right? This very clever move to call out people in the audience who are the best. So he heightens this sense of groupness, and then he continues to heighten the sense of the groupness by appealing to the wisdom of the crowd.
So, do we tell these people to get out, number one, or do we work with them and let them stay in something? Okay, are you ready? I'm just curious. Because it's a very interesting situation. No, wait. So the bad ones, the gang members, all that, what do you think? Anybody disagree with the gang members? Is there one person? Yeah, there's a gang member over there.
Okay, so again, that us versus them, right? So what do you guys think? This allows them to be participants in the conversation, in the argument. That one person, he must be a gang member over there. This kind of thing, it energizes his audience. It rewards them, right? It suggests to them that they're better, more sensible, more informed. They know more than the opposition. The opposition are losers, right, in Trump's language. According to Trump, our enemies are not just those people outside. Trump also characterizes his political opponents as enemies, right? His political opponents are not simply people who have similar values, who have a different sensibility about how we might achieve it in the world. They're actually the bad guys. And because they're the bad guys, because they're our enemies, he doesn't engage with their ideas. If you're talking about enemies, you don't have to deal with their ideas. Instead, you engage their personalities. And so he engages in what we call ad hominem attacks.
So I just learned that Crooked Hillary, along with her friend, she's got this goofy friend named Elizabeth Warren. She's on her Twitter rant. She's a goofus. She is a goofus. So, Elizabeth, you ever see her? I mean, this woman, she's a basket case. By the way, she's done nothing in the United States Senate.
Right, so if you've got someone who's, again, they're enemies, we don't have to deal with them substantively, right? And so it wasn't just Hillary and Elizabeth Warren. We had Lion Ted, Little Marco, Low Energy Jeff. He did it throughout the campaign, the primary and the prior to the primaries. If your political opponents, again, they're not people with whom you simply disagree, but they're enemies. If they're your enemies, actually, what do you need to do with them? You need to destroy them. And this is what leads Trump to threaten violence.
We'll get more and more angry as we go along. So, and by the end, I'll say, get them the hell out of here. And then, by the way, by that time, the security will be so tough and so nasty. And you know what's going to happen when that happens? You're not going to have any more problems. You're not going to have any more problems.
Okay? So your opponents are your enemies. We're going to threaten violence. Here's another clip.
It's to abolish, essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is error. But
Okay, right? I mean, this was a clip that was talked about a lot. He's threatening gun violence against Hillary Clinton. This borders on the illegal, from what I understand. It is, again, so far beyond the pale. And so one of the things we should be asking is, how in the world does he get away with this? How do his followers sort of accept this? Is this considered part of a political discourse? One of the things he does, he engages in a rhetorical technique referred to as paralipses. That was exactly what that is. It's paralipses, or in a more colloquial fashion, I'm not saying it, I'm just saying it. And this is a compilation of, he does this all the time.
The new governor is doing much better than him, but we won't say it. I would say he's incompetent, but I don't want to do that because that's not nice. I didn't say it. I didn't say anything. In one case, I said what that particular person wrote about himself. I never attacked him on his look, and believe me, there's plenty of subject matter right there.
So this, I'm not saying it, I'm just saying it. It gives him plausible deniability, right? This is why he's able to sort of slip his way out of having to take responsibility for what it is he said. One of the other things we see from Trump is that he displays incredible, almost unspeakable hubris, right? Typically, hubris is really off-putting, but for some reason, I'll talk about why it may have worked for Trump. Let's just listen to it.
You know, the best negotiators in the world. And I'm the one that made all of the right predictions. I'm proud of myself. I've done an amazing job. And he can do that like me. Believe me. Not doing that to brag, because you know what? I don't have to brag. I don't have. Well, actually, Putin did call me a genius, and he said I'm the future of the Republican Party.
Okay, so constantly bragging about himself, but again, he's not bragging, engaging in that parallipses. Typically we don't like people who are braggarts, but think about what he's done. He tells us we are a nation in tremendous crisis. He tells us we have enemies both within and outside of our borders. He suggests to us he is the one person who can overcome these enemies that we face. He's so consistent, he appears authentic. He appeals to his past business success to support these claims. And if we point out that his businesses, in fact, were often failures, then we're part of the enemy, right? We're the fake news, or we're the crooked media, right?
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I will try to do my best. So he's able to engage with this kind of hubris, partly because he's mollified or disregarded anyone who would say anything different. And of course, we all know this is going to lead to making America great again.
To all Americans tonight, in all of our cities and in all of our towns, I make this promise. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. God bless you and good night. I love you.
Okay, so we have this nation in crisis, but we're going to make America great again. That's a really interesting phrase, because what it suggests is that we're going to return to some kind of mythical America. Now, a lot of politicians appeal to a mythical America. Barack Obama does. But when Barack Obama talks about it, it's aspirational, right? He's aspiring to something we have not yet achieved. We're building on past successes, right? From his second inauguration, he talked about the path from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, right? That it's this struggle. When when Donald Trump says that we're going to make America great again, it suggests that we're moving backwards. It suggests we're moving back to something that was already there. That's a whole lot easier, right, than trying to build on something that's fraught and difficult. It's like George Lakoff, another scholar, talks about Brexit this way, right? That if you think about an exiting, then you're also entering. So think about entering a coffee shop. In order to get back where you were before, all you have to do is walk back out the door. It's a relatively simple cognitive process. And in the same way, Trump is telling us that we're going back. It's ambiguous, but it's hopeful. And Trump's strength is America's strength. Okay? It's going to help us get back to where we were. So what's next? I don't know. That's why this slide is blank. I think one of the really scary things about Donald Trump is that to date, no one has been able to hold him accountable, right? He's been able to get away with saying all kinds of things that have never been said before in American political history. I think we absolutely need to figure out a way to hold him accountable, but my time is up, and so I'm going to leave it to my colleagues to try and offer that suggestion. Thanks.
Look at this.
Is it Chomp, all right? Okay.
It's not you, is it?
Here's my office. As Sarah said, thank you all for coming. Thanks for inviting us to be here, Lauren. I'm going to take an angle on some of Trump's rhetoric in a direction that I hope is complementary to what Sarah has talked about with Trump's speeches. I thought it'd be fun to sort of think a little bit about Twitter and Trump's tweets, which have clearly been a significant part of his campaign, generated a lot of discussion about what the function of Twitter is politically, how it's used, what are its strengths and limitations. And I'm sort of a very light user of Twitter myself, so I'm hoping that I can learn something during our discussion about Twitter and Trump's use of tweets. So clearly, these are just a few headlines pulled out of media sources from the past year or so that comment upon Trump's use of Twitter and his ability to basically shake up his opponents, flummox them, how he was able to trump Obama, the teleprompter president, suggesting what were some of the rhetorical functions that he was able to achieve with his Twitter use. So there's been a lot of media analysis of Twitter, and some scholarly analysis is also starting to emerge. I'll point to one study in particular later on. And mostly what I just want to accomplish today is to lay out some possibilities for how people have thought about Twitter, how we might think about Trump and his tweets, and what that might mean for political engagement going forward. Some of this there's an interesting article in Politico right around the end of the primary season that started to do some kind of rudimentary content analysis of Trump's tweets, right? His favorite word is I and you. We're going to come back to that. I'll come back to that in a little while. Some of the favorite Trumpian terms are probably familiar if you've followed Trump at all on Twitter, right? Winner, failed, nasty, loser. All of these kinds of things are certainly markers that we have come to recognize from him. Another graphic that they put together says Trump tweets more adjectives than any candidate during the primary except Bernie Sanders, and he directs them constantly at other people. So great, right? One of his favorite words. Trump at that point, Trump had used that 32 times in referring to himself. Marco Rubio, however, got 47 references as a lightweight by Trump. Jeb and Hillary were identified as weak multiple times, and so you get to start to see some very basic patterns of his tweets. George Lakoff, a linguist who Sarah referred to earlier, had an article, an interview on the media last week that started to lay out a taxonomy, like what are the different kinds of tweets that he has. So he talks about the idea of preemptive framing, that Trump uses tweets in order to frame a particular issue or topic in ways that are favorable to him before his opponents can. And so, one of his tweets had to do with reframing that, he would have certainly won the popular vote if there hadn't been all the voter fraud going on. A prominent one that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail is that Trump uses tweets to divert attention from the real issues that are taking place. I think there's both some truth to that, but also some problems with that. His little altercation with Meryl Streep after the Golden Globes is often cited as an example of Trump using a tweet in order to generate a manufactured controversy that deflects from more substantive political issues. Sometimes he uses them as a trial balloon. Lakoff suggests that when Trump tweeted out that America needs to increase its nuclear capability, that was a way for him to sort of test the waters, see how people would react to it, and also deflection. So when an issue comes up, he tries to deflect the topic to some other aspect, and his attack on media organizations after the release of the dossier is an example of that, right? Rather than talk about the content of the dossier, he starts going after CNN with both barrels, right? So these are some examples, right? His preemptive framing is the Unaffordable Care Act will soon be history, one of his famous 3 a.m. tweets. And again, this is an example of how he diverts attention from the dossier issue to CNN. Their ratings are tanking. Their credibility will soon be gone. And I think some of these ideas suggest that there are other kinds of tweets beyond those that are identified by Lakoff. It seems to me that his insults of others, his praise of certain people, and his personal boasting are perhaps more prominent or prevalent than some of the other content that he is talking about. And it's these kinds of relationships that he is trying to articulate in his tweets that I think are especially important, more so than the substantive content of the tweets. The big question I would encourage all of you to think about is, who is his audience, how is he relating to them, and how is he arraying the world? And I think this dovetails a lot with Sarah's discussion of identification and scapegoating and the us-them rhetoric. I think you see this in his tweets in sort of a more condensed form. And so, for example, right, Trump is able to use tweets to recycle or repurpose other forms of media, attach his own ideas, and gain recognition for small business optimism and his influence over that. The New York Times, you may have seen, right, they started to compile all of the insults that Trump was able to generate over Twitter since declaring his candidacy. I mean, they had something like 280 some, I think, at the last count. And what this brings up is that there's something important and perhaps distinctive that we should pay attention to with regard to the medium of Twitter itself. The media theorist Marshall McLuhan, some of you may be familiar with, made this claim that the medium is the message. Right? Even more so than the content, the medium is the message. And why does he think that? It's because the medium, in his view, shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. It's that last line, that last part about human association, right? Our connection with one another, the relationship between speaker and audience, that is particularly important, and that the medium itself, each medium has certain ways of helping to build or foster certain kinds of connections over others. One of the first studies that I've seen come out that focuses specifically on Trump's Twitter usage in terms of communication comes from a scholar, Brian Ott, a piece that just came out. And what he identifies by looking at some psychological studies of Twitter users, by doing some analysis, is that in general, Twitter as a medium has certain kinds of affordances. By affordances, he means that the medium makes certain kinds of things possible, certain kinds of activities more likely than others. He says, for example, that Twitter demands, as a medium, it demands simplicity, right? The short 140-word limit requires you to speak in simple, emphatic, declarative kind of statements, right? It works against complexity or complex forms of reasoning. It also promotes impulsivity, right? It's an easy-to-use medium compared to, say, writing a book or engaging in other sorts of media activities. It's always available. Any of you could be tweeting out some baloney about what I'm saying right now, right? All I see are graduate students, yeah, they're tweeting away like crazy, right? Right? Doesn't take a whole lot of effort. And it fosters incivility, right? And this is, I think, an interesting claim that you might want to think about a bit more. Ott suggests that the informal nature of discourse in Twitter and its relative impersonality, right? That you can say things and be somewhat shielded or distant from those who you are referring to, allows incivil kinds of discourse to emerge, right? The kinds of discourse that seems to violate our accepted norms for political discourse. Ott goes on to make an interesting point, which I would agree with, and that is that Trump's natural speaking style, which you saw in all of these clips that Sarah offered, is almost like a hand-in-glove fit with the nature of Twitter as a medium. Right? That the way that he speaks seems to just fit right in. And Trump, of course, has said, some people have said, you know, I am the best person at 140 character writing. You know, I think there's something to that, right? That his way of speaking is fits hand in glove with these kinds of affordances that Twitter makes possible. This idea was borne out very interestingly at MIT, where a postdoc developed a Twitter bot or a robot that would automatically generate tweets. And that the automatic generation of the deep drum Twitter handle was based on an algorithm where they took everything that Trump said during the primary debates, they fed it into a computer, and then they used this bot to essentially generate fake tweets that sounded very much like what Trump actually says. So, for example, right, math, and they would come up with these little prompts occasionally to sort of get the bot started. Math is a common Democrat lie. It can't make the budget great. I'll have the best economy. That was not generated by Trump. Okay, this is my point. Not generated by Trump, but sounds like it, right? We have to get rid of a lot of the press. I called for a temporary ban. We heard that phrase in one of Sarah's clips, right? And we really have the people's support, right? Again, it's drawing on these patterns in Trump's actual speech, fitting them into Twitter, and I think it's very suggestive to reinforce Ott's point that there's a nice affinity between Trump's regular rhetoric and his tweets. This is something, too, right? Would not be surprising to see this coming from Trump itself, right? With a nice exclamation point at the end, right? Incomplete sentence, selling this country down the drain. So, what do we make of this? How should we interpret Trump's rhetoric, specifically his use of tweets, and the sense that there seems to be a pattern to what he's doing, even if it's not necessarily strategic or intentional in the way that we might think of other rhetoric? Well, probably one of the most pithy interpretations of Trump's rhetoric came from a writer for The Atlantic, Selena Zito, who said, "The press takes him literally but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously but not literally." Right? Seize on that for a while. One of the things that makes Trump's rhetoric, I think, challenging to analyze, okay, is wrapped up in this, right? Rational analysis of his rhetoric may only take us so far in helping to unpack what's going on with his rhetoric and how it's being used to mobilize audiences and generate political effect. In response to this, one of Trump's advisors later on in an MSNBC interview said, no, don't take him literally, take him symbolically. When he's sending out tweets or speaking in a certain way that sets the hair on fire of the nation's media, particularly the left-wing media, I think his supporters, right, audience, I think his supporters see that more as symbolism and a rejection of that sort of egg and tomato throwing, right? I mean, we can sort of, dismiss a little bit, but I think that the point that he is trying to make here, right, is that his supporters interpret those tweets differently. Right? And they do it symbolically, like they read into it a certain kind of relationship that they want to have with Trump. And at some level, this is true of all political discourse, right? That the political rhetoric is symbolic. That's happened well before Twitter. But the point is to ask how Twitter then functions to build these kinds of relationships between speaker and audience, even apart from the specific substantive content. So one of the things that it does, right, is that his tweets help to mobilize political supporters as early as sort of before the primaries kind of really got underway. journalists were observing that Trump had all kinds of supporters who would spring into action, and when he made a provocative remark or say something that was seemingly beyond the pale, they would go into full force. So when he made his crack about Carly Fiorina's face, they would engage in emotional debates with his critics, ensuring that he remains the subject of a constant conversation, right? Keeping Trump in the limelight itself. And as one, I think, astute political observer, Dave Weigel, has pointed out, it turned out that Trump could beat Clinton even with voters who disliked both of them. Why? Because in his view, Democrats had been baited, right? They took the bait of these kind of pseudo-controversies, and that helped to get Democratic supporters off message. Right? That they weren't putting their own positive vision forward, and certainly there have been several critiques of the Clinton campaign on that basis, that they relied too much on assuming that people would just think Trump is disgusting and didn't do enough to put their own vision out. Again, a debatable point, but I think it reinforces this idea that the medium and its ability to create human associations is the thing that we want to focus on. So. What exactly did these tweets then do for him? Right? They help him build certain kinds of association. And I think the important thing to realize is that the tweets, in my view, are not so much about distraction from the real issues, but in fact they support a certain kind of recognition for him. Right? It's about building his credibility, not necessarily as a rational, logical speaker, but developing his character in a way that resonates with what audiences are seeking. And so Amanda Hess, who writes in the New York Times, her take is that it's not that Trump is engaging in some devious plot to deflect attention from real issues. In fact, what we really need to see him is as a celebrity. And that his use of Twitter is very much like celebrity status, to keep himself in the limelight at all times. And this raises, I think, for Hess, the problem of accountability. That again, that's something that Sarah had mentioned. This first line, I think, really nails it. Twitter provides the veneer of populist connection, right? Human association, but without the hassle of accountability. And that this is a real problem, because journalists, as I'll say a little bit more in a little bit, journalists, right, are glomming on to Twitter in significant ways that is reshaping media coverage of him. And so I think one of the big open questions is whether or not Twitter can be effectively leveraged by Trump's opponents to kind of help move journalists out of that intoxicating rush that they get from engaging Trump's tweets all the time. So one of the things that this raises for me is what exactly is the role of the media and how do they respond to his tweets? Trump, of course, is playing upon that, right? After having discredited so many media sources, right? He's using his tweets, again, to build a stronger sense of association and connection directly between himself and the people. Directly between himself and supporters, so that the media is unable or less able to mediate that relationship. Right? We don't have the same kind of gatekeeping function that Sarah's talking about when we just had the three major networks. And so this is one of the most important political moves that I think emerges from the rise of Twitter and Trump's ability to master Twitter for this particular campaign. So, to conclude, I just want to say a few things about how we might think about how else might Twitter be used. Okay? It's not to say that there aren't other strategies for engaging with Trump, but if we want to just think about Twitter itself, I think there are several things to think about. The first is that Twitter is not one thing, and this is where I sort of part ways with Ott a little bit. I mean, it's not all just Twitter takes you down a complete hellhole. Okay. In my own field of environmental communication, there's been some interesting studies of how environmental advocacy groups are using Twitter to engage in the political process. And so Brett Hutchins, a scholar, reminds us that it serves different purposes depending on the social and political context in which it is deployed, and can be used to do a lot of different things. they study the Green Party in Tasmania in particular, he and his colleague Libby Lester, and they start to draw out from their analysis of Twitter feeds and websites and interviews with Green political figures, they start to draw out some of the things that Twitter can do for us. What are the affordances or the possibilities that are available in the media itself? And I can talk about some specific examples during our discussion period, but certainly, right, the ability for groups to intervene in the news cycle, to engage with unfolding events. One of the examples that they talk about is how folks in the Parliament were tweeting back and forth with constituents so that they could pose questions to their opponents. Both sustaining one's base, but also using Twitter to reach out to the unconverted, to journalists who may not necessarily hold their point of view, and to those who might be potential supporters later on, as well as coordinating action, which of course we've seen globally in the last several years. Studies of journalists, in fact, have shown that journalists use Twitter as the most prominent social media platform that they have. It's more important to them, these interviews showed, it's more important to them than Facebook or other forms of social media. So at some level, it's important for activists to take Twitter seriously. This study, again, interviewed journalists after the 2012 presidential election and found that Twitter was most effective in their journalistic practice for finding and tracking breaking news, right? How is it that activists could help to create news events that journalists might cover? That's one way in which Twitter can be leveraged. For crowdsourcing, right? How might journalists be able to find different voices that perhaps they wouldn't normally find through their usual reporting, as well as maintaining awareness of others, seeing how other people react and respond to unfolding political events. That's one way in which you can make your voice heard, is by by engaging with Twitter, following those hashtags, so that may be something that politicians could pick up on. So, two final things. One is, as Lakoff points out, it's important that we don't take the bait, and that we figure out how we take the bait. Lakoff's opinion was that after the election, the majority has been pointing out what's wrong with Trump day after day, fighting against Trump, and that what this does is that it keeps him in the limelight rather than highlighting the majority's positive moral view, right? This is Lakoff's big thing. Trump is a minority president. Right? We are in the majority. What he's trying to say is, right, to effectively fight for what is right, you have to lead with your own viewpoint, not saying, here's what Trump said and here's why it's BS, or here's why it's problematic. Lead with your values, lead with your vision, not with that of your opponent. That's sort of the positive way of engaging. Or there's another way, and that's what we might call turning the tables. Eugene Robinson, a op-ed writer for the Washington Post, said, look, I don't think Trump is engaged in this distraction thing, but that doesn't mean that we can ignore his tweets. We need to see how those tweets are functioning. They're functioning for recognition. And we see that his pattern of action and reaction is one where he will respond to slights. He can't seem to ignore that, and that is a sign of weakness. So if you want to get down and play dirty politics, you need to find out, study up on some of my favorite political philosophers, Sun Tzu and Tony Soprano, who say, if your enemy is of choleric temper, irritate him. It plays into his desire to be recognized, but could help to break down and challenge some of the associations and connections that he offers up in some of his other tweets. Thanks.
There we go. I'm not a rhetorical scholar. They did all the heavy lifting and looking at what Trump says, how he says it, what it means. And I've been listening to a lot of that. Yesterday on NPR, you may have listened to a piece that was called Trump the Comic Hero. That included Jen Murcia, who we talked about, who was a colleague of mine when I was at Texas A&M University, and somebody I was also a colleague with at North Dakota State University, John Murphy. And they've done a lot of looking at presidential rhetoric over time. I'm not a rhetorical scholar. I'm an organizational communications scholar. And as I've been listening to the election, as I've been watching what's happening, I happened to be in Florida for a conference when Trump was there. He prevented me from getting to discount tickets to Disney World because I didn't want to be shot by Secret Service, was why I couldn't go get those tickets. So this has impacted me personally, and I would like to take a look at how does this fit overall in the structure. And the first thing I thought of was when I teach Introduction to Organizational Communication, we talk about systems and how when we communicate as a society and we start looking at that collective level, that really we enact our society by interconnecting with each other in some very complex ways. And the thing that best explains how there ended up being a victory for Trump on November 4th, as Sarah addressed, is chaos, right? Chaos theory is a part of complex systems. And so we're going to look at Trump and chaos and communication. I happened to go to Philadelphia the morning after the election and watch riots and within 30 feet of what was framed a riot by the police. It looked like some pretty active kids who were upset. I don't know that they destroyed anything. And seeing a lot of other reactions across the world. And so as we look at this and we think about Trump, his campaign is really chaotic, right? It feels chaotic. At each step, as I looked back at my own reflections on what was happening during the election, it seemed like every step he was expected to fail any moment, right? I thought it was a really good visual to see him going down an escalator when he started his campaign, right? I remember reacting to that going, why down and not up? Right? But I think for other ways that worked rhetorically to see himself lowering himself to the people. But it doesn't fit any expectations of elections. The way he acted would fail for a lot of other people. Internal party opponents were trying to take him down. There were people from outside. Other candidates were accusing Democrats of coming in and voting for Trump to have an easier candidate to beat for whoever ended up with the nomination, right? If I had still lived in Texas, I probably would have done that as a personal confession, because where I lived in Texas, there were always Republican candidates in the primary. There were sometimes Democrats, usually libertarians, but that was the menu of choices. So you picked your Republican and possibly voted in a different primary. Trump seemed to attack everyone. He used Twitter and rallies instead of getting out and actually meeting the people, and those all flew in the face of what was happening before. He was constantly in the news as outrageous and ridiculous, and how could he possibly succeed? Sarah talked a lot about what led to Trump's success, as did Steve. And so if we do look at what I said earlier, that if we look at our world as this conflagrated, crazy set of interactions, as an intersected complex system, there are a couple of key ideas I'm going to extract from chaos theory to look at and try to explain what happened and possibly how we go forward. So if you think about Trump's communicating, right, a lot of this has been said, and I'm going to skip, that he prefers Twitter and rallies, that the media is making news about vilifying him, so it was still about him. The Muslim terrorists are the actual enemies. He emboldened racists and others who feel disempowered because of their whiteness or their being excluded as mainstream America over the past history. Globalism, he taps into that. One of the things that comes out of globalism that we talk about in organizational communication is that it does create interconnections, but that also creates a sense of nationalism or tribalism for various people. And they may not be physically connected, but things like Twitter and broadcast rallies allow those people to come together even though they aren't face-to-face, right? So they can electronically connect, sympathize, and become a part of something. So he taps into that nationalism. Three things I just added to this right before we started were from driving in my car, gripping the steering wheel, and listening to his speech today. He talked about putting America first, buying American. He specifically talked about us versus them on defense, how we have been ridiculous at spending a lot of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars to defend other countries, yet we can't effectively protect our own borders. Right? A very clear us versus them sort of approach. And all of that comes together in an interesting way because he was, as people have said, he has a really high disapproval rating. He has the lowest approval rating of any incoming president. He lost the popular vote by over 3 million, yet has the presidency. So how do we understand that? in a lot of ways, when we talk about something being chaotic, it really started with weather, which makes sense because it seems like predicting the weather is hard. Forecasting is the actual word. It's not predicting, right? Most likely it will lead to this. And if you think about some sort of visual for a more complex system of interaction, I don't know if you've ever seen these huge flocks of birds, like starlings or other grackles, and as they move, and if you watch a video of it, it's mesmerizing because there is some sort of pattern to it, but it is not a very predictable or linear pattern. They don't fly in a cube, right? They don't keep equal distance. They don't hold the military formation. Instead, it seems like it's this chaotic mess, but there's a flow to it and a movement to it. And that's a good way to think about chaos, right? That's why Lorenz started this in '63, was to explain how could small changes in a weather system lead to lots of different outcomes, or the same type of weather pattern leads to something very different or even contradictory. So when we do that, one of the terms that I thought of as I listened to a lot of my colleagues, I watched a lot of people on Facebook talking about the numbness the day after the election, the surprise, the utter being gobsmacked of how could this have happened. And I instantly thought of this notion of a cosmology episode. This is actually a picture of post-earthquake in China in 2010. A cosmology episode occurs when people suddenly and deeply feel that the universe is no longer a rational, orderly system. It doesn't make sense, right? What makes such an incident so shattering is that both your sense of what's happening and the way that you rebuild is all collapsing together at the same time. Does that make sense? Right? And I think for a lot of people, this felt like a cosmology episode, right? That the polls said Hillary was going to win. There was no chance for Trump. He was never given a chance, yet he kept proceeding. But it didn't make sense to our understanding of politics, right? And so we had a cosmology episode. And that was, for a lot of people, that's the way they responded to the election of Trump. It completely shattered what they knew. And the typical reaction is, I've never been here before, I have no idea where I am, and I have no idea who can help me. This actually comes from some of my research in risk and crisis work, where we look at how major crises create a cosmology episode for organizations, for countries, post the tsunami, post a major earthquake, post we suddenly, as ConAgra, sent out all these pot pies and people are getting sick and dying from them. Also, and I think it also applies, do you think it applies to how people have felt that you know? That it was this sort of cosmology episode? Right? Well, this often precedes this process of self-organization. And I think Steve and Sarah have led into some good ways that we can go forward to self-organize. I have one more term that I want to use from chaos theory. But usually after a cosmology episode, it creates a moment or an opportunity for new possibilities, or the possibility of going down a further, darker path, right? Insert Darth Vader sound here. Right? We may face that, or any other unknowns. There are a lot of possibilities, but it includes new possibilities and an opportunity for learning. So that's a cosmology episode, and I think that helps explain how people can make sense of their own reaction. It is not an abnormal reaction to something that is that surprising, right? The second thing is a strange attractor. Strange attractors are things that happen where suddenly things mysteriously group to certain points that can't really be predicted, right? Trump, you could argue, is a strange attractor. We'll talk about that in a moment, but also the strange attractor or detractor from traditional media, traditional politics. And I think Trump is very good in the way he presents things to say anything that the media says could be false, because that's media as usual, it's politics as usual. Today in his address, he talked about how we will no longer tolerate politicians who are all talk and no action. We are going to be action, right? So you go away from that, and toward him, we're going to have a lot of action. Action can be bad, right? It can be destructive. It can completely destroy things. But a strange attractor is where you could have a minority vote president ending up winning an election, beating a lot of traditional candidates by not winning primaries with a majority of votes, right? That is a strange attractor, and those things happen. The other part of that is cascade effects. Sometimes a lot of things go together, right? Like if you're pouring into a pile of sand, it's every grain of sand has the chance to go in one direction or another, but suddenly you'll have a whole side of the face shift and drop away because something big happens and it goes in an interesting pattern. The world is not nice and neat, and neither are our relationships. So I thought of this, and then I did a little bit of research, and I found that somebody else, Eli, I would say Soaphouse, thought the same thing on September 24th before the election. So I can't claim originality to this idea, and I apologize for all of the quotations. I want to pick a couple of things out. He said, I don't predict this based on any love for Trump, right? But his video victory is based on the principles of chaos theory or strange attractors, how we make conscious and chiefly unconscious decisions based on emotions, how our brains retain information that is more visual than verbal and more survivalist than cerebral, right? That is his way of saying bringing a wide coalition of people together that was still a minority to Trump is what he was predicting was going to happen with, and that Clinton would respond in a more linear kind of way, right? Linear solutions building upon what happened before, logic, facts, and analysis. Trump will offer emotion, a magnification of the perceived chaos, fueling his supporters, and the promise of emergence from chaos, right? Just what the fearful and the angry, the disenfranchised, and the desperate want is a strange attractor, right? You can reject both the progressives and you can reject the traditional Republicans at the same time in this kind of a strange attractor logic, right? Because it's not an either or, it's something new and different, and it draws a wide variety of people to them, as well as pushing people away and disenfranchising them about your opponent. So what do? How do we face strange attractors, especially in reflecting that's what it was that created a cosmology episode for a lot of people? And I think there are two parts to this. One is resilience, and the other is renewal. Both together is better than just resilience alone. Resilience is being able to withstand crisis and to stand up to a crisis. And I've seen a lot of people talking about, right, in writing, people writing about coming together, being connected, how this will create a new and interesting coalition of people, as well as renewal, right? In the Democratic Party, for example, what are they going to look like? How are they going to make changes, right? Are they going to make changes? And will a coalesced opposition come together? So when we think about renewal, the answer to that is really a discourse of renewal. And we use this a lot for organizations, focusing on learning what has happened before and understanding. I think hearing things like, this is understanding what Trump is doing rhetorically allows you to name it, target it, and think about how to counteract it, right? Which we've heard a lot of today from Sarah and from Steve. Having ethical communication, finding that centering, something to attract to in an ethical kind of way, enacting an ethical something, proposal that can come together, a prospective vision about where we go in the future, not just a continuation of the success, that I think Hillary based a lot of her campaign rhetoric on, that there's more to do, but we didn't know what that was, and there was nothing that she was particularly opposed to that got a lot of traction in the media, and strong leadership, right? So if you think about those two as opposed to each other, this is one of the areas that I look at are things like natural disasters and floods and how communities respond. I happen to live in North Dakota in '97 when there was a huge flood. You can't have renewal without resilience, but you can have resilience without renewal. And the difference between that is this is Winnipeg, Manitoba. After there was a huge flood in '97, massive destruction, Winnipeg decided to create this massive diversion project, and they completely redid their community. Fargo, where I lived at the time, on the other hand, sandbagged their way through this thing, right? They sandbagged, we would get calls at 2 in the morning, the community would show up, it was amazing, it showed a lot of strength, and we survived the flood. Partly in a chaos theory way, by accident. I was setting up a shelter for the Red Cross at 2 in the morning, they called for sandbaggers, a lot of people showed up, they added 2 feet because the reading they got was off, it didn't make sense, there was going to be a lot more water. Later they discovered it was a faulty gauge, right? Oh, we didn't need to do all that work. Well, they ended up needing all but 2 inches of it, right? Or they would have flooded. Well, they survived it through sandbagging, so the next time the flood comes, instead of having the political will to redo and do a diversion project like Grand Forks and Winnipeg did, they sandbagged again, right? Let's do it, right? Too stubborn to fail. We will sandbag every time this river does this, which is often, right? Because it flows north, and you know about ice jams in Montana, same sort of thing. And so politically the question is, for that extended example, how do people respond in a way that includes their resilience, but with an eye toward renewal? Not just, we will survive this in 4 years and the next candidate we have will be better, right, from a democratic perspective, but as a chance to actually engage in thinking and relearning from that cosmology episode. So you're saying there's a chance, right? So if you think about communication approaches, I think the first thing is to be vigilant about reframing what is happening. John Murphy, somebody I spoke of before and was on that NPR segment yesterday, he started doing linguistic alerts on Facebook. He has 2 so far, and the administration is fairly recent. The first one he's proposed is, and I'm sorry if this is too small for you to see in the back, access versus coverage. One of the linguistic things he talked about is how Trump promises access to insurance for all, but not coverage for all. That you have a chance to get insurance, don't know how much it will cost or if you can actually afford it, but you will have access. And access is different than coverage. The other thing that he just sent out a couple of hours ago was, note when pundits, scholars, and supporters are talking about how Trump won the working class vote, the data is about white working class, right? Which is interesting to me, being the son of a Teamster, who would not have voted for Trump, being on the UFA executive board and a union supporter. I think that is, and I think we can segment that further, right? I think that there is a disenfranchised element of the white working class, because the union people I know and the white working class people I know don't fall into that category. They were not one, right? And so being careful about that. False dichotomies, avoiding some of those. This also is from at least my remembering and speaking it into my phone from hearing his address today. Trump said, we want to get people off of welfare and back to work. Well, let's push back on that a little bit. That is not what is really happening. Supporting the media, accountability for Trump and others. Steve already spoke to that. Some sort of prospective vision of where we go, creating a means to organize. And I think the big question is, what are the new strange attractors, right? What will emerge from this as a strange attractor to draw a wide coalition, a majority of voters in response? In some ways, I'm excited to see how strongly it has mobilized people, coalesced people, and I think that creates hope for a lot of people. And how do we do that? In chaos theory, we talk about the sweet spot, this requisite variety. You don't want to be overly rigid and structured and stick within the formal means that exist now, but you can't be overly chaotic either. Going back to that flock of birds analogy, right? If the flock of birds was overly rigid and they flew in a flying cube, like I talked about before, they have no capacity to deal with turbulent things that happen in their environment, like a cell tower, right? All you would see is, like in a cartoon, boom, 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 the birds are gone in the shape of the cell tower and the cube stays flying, right? Until they encounter another obstacle. Yet they don't fly into each other. These complex adaptive systems figure out ways of responding to each other, working together, and having that collective sense of togetherness. If it was totally random, a certain percentage of the birds would be dropping out of the sky. And how do we take that analogy into political action is probably that next question or next step in organizing. How can we think beyond what we've thought of before and draw on the strength that did create a majority vote, right? And finding that balance is one of the lessons that comes out of Sweet Spots. So I just finished teaching a graduate seminar on communicating community. We talk about communities of practice coming together. So developing practices where we engage with one another, we share tactics or developing a shared repertoire, and we can collectively navigate or negotiate a journey forward would be what needs to happen for the part of America that experienced that cosmology episode on that Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. Okay, that's what I had.
So, I'm sure you have some questions, or I don't know how you want to.
Yeah, I don't
We'll
know.
grab the
We'll
stools.
grab the stools.
Okay.
Oh,
great.
I
Oh,
like
yeah, look
that.
at that.
I like the stools.
So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank y'all so much. That was very interesting. I was wondering if we could draw one subject a little further out, and then sort of strategies that progressive organizations or campaigns can adopt. You know, we talk about Trump's success, and some of the things are like narcissism and scapegoating, or things that, you know, directions we don't want to go. And there are things that Trump did that would only work for Donald Trump, right? But then in talking about sort of more survivalist communication and cerebral communication, maybe, which is similar to values or emotional messaging. You know, there's some of these things that maybe we can all learn from. So I guess, do y'all have any thoughts on sort of things that Trump did well, that, you know, we could all do that are both effective and sort of speak to the angels of our better natures instead of kind of taking that darker path?
Go ahead, Sarah. Well, I was just thinking that you really touched on some of these, including, and again, this comes from George Lakoff, who's a really interesting scholar and activist. If you're not familiar with his work, he wrote a book titled "Don't Think of an Elephant," that talks a lot about what he started this actually after the Gingrich revolution, if you want to call it that. Part of the contract on America, not the contract in America. But he wanted to know, right? Why did the Republicans win at that time, and what can we do? And this is when he came up with this discussion about different moral worldviews. He talks a lot about metaphor, and he talks about the fact that the conservatives are very good at articulating their worldview, and what they have, he refers to it as a strict father morality. Excuse me. And he talks about how things that seemingly don't go together, like gun control and being opposed to reproductive rights and sorry, grab that water.
Sure.
Thank you. I got it. Thanks. About how those things go together, and he talks about sort of the metaphorical connections that underlie that moral system. What he tells us is that liberals also have a very strong moral system, but we're not nearly as good as at articulating it. He refers to it as the nurturant parent family. Thank you so much. Oh, it's cool too. And
I'm drinking your old warm water.
Worms drink my warm water. He talks about the fact that we need to be better at articulating what those connections are. This notion that, you know, family values belong to the conservatives is really annoying, right? Because I'm sorry, I'm assuming most people in here are progressives, like we are. We have family values too. They just look very different, right? Some of them are. And they're prioritized differently. So being able to really articulate those. So again, don't think of an elephant is a really good resource that I would suggest for people. And again, this also comes from Lakoff. He said one of the problems with Hillary's campaign is that a lot of people have talked about this. We underestimated that group of people who was ready to be roused, the disaffected, distrustful portion of the electorate. But we also repeated Trump's statements rather than articulating our own. And again, this is what Steve was saying. And so I think, you know, again, sort of instead of, you know, let's stop doing that, even though that's what we were doing up here today. We need to understand it, but then really articulating our worldview. And I'm going to let one of you guys talk, because I can't.
Sure. You want to go, Steve, or you want me to?
Well, I mean, just to build on that a little bit, I mean, this is sort of an ongoing debate that I think a lot of people in the progressive community have with Lakoff, is like how far does reframing and how far does framing get you as strategy? It's like, you know, I mean, in my view, it's important, but it's one piece of the puzzle. And Bill and Sarah's point, right, one thing that did allow Trump to get as many votes as he is mobilizing a latent group. So it's not just about reinforcing the base, which I think, you know, a lot of the messaging from the Clinton campaign did that. It's also about reaching out to the vast majority of the population that did not vote. And so like to me that's like a significantly different task than turning out those who are already with you. So I mean, I think that's, I mean, I don't know the solution to that, but I think that's something that's a little more complicated than just sort of having the right message.
Yeah, two quick thoughts on that real quick and then jump there. So I think reframing and naming is a part of the process. As I was thinking about this, if I were consulting with Democrats on how to reframe that, I would not reprint individual tweets from Trump, but rather start a tweets are talk not action counter campaign, right? Where you treat them in lump sum and you use visuals like this. This is who this is, and this is what's actually happening out of these tweets, rather than giving each individualized respect. You treat them as a whole and respond to them as that. The other thing I think that comes out of it is, and some things I didn't say because this gets really, I think, complex quickly, is to think about how a lot of things that are commonly said and held as sort of tropes in American public view, like it doesn't really matter who gets elected. It's all the same. He is an outsider and that's automatically better than an insider, are things that I think can be pushed back against, but you have to select which ones, because if you go against that outsiders are bad, you instantly have labeled yourself as an insider and made yourself vulnerable. So I think it gets complex and tricky quickly, but I think stepping back for a moment is perhaps a first step of that.
Jim?
Oh, thanks, Joel. Hey, Mark, you guys did a great job of elucidating and describing the disgruntled, middle American, but a community that got surprising support from, the evangelicals. And you, Joel, as a guy that lived in East Texas, know that they come from a very codified, regimented, hierarchical system, and I can't imagine that he would be successful with them. And is it because their hierarchical system had their, the guy in the $1,000 suit in the auditorium church telling him you must vote for Trump, it's God's will? Is that what swayed them? Or is there something in the Trump message that appeals to people with that subset of beliefs that they're so unwilling to cross?
Yeah, I think the strange attractor thing works really well there, in that sense that a lot of people came to vote for Trump for a wide variety of reasons, each mobilized for something or against something. My own personal belief, and talking to some friends I still have in East Texas especially, is that the message was you can vote to put a Supreme Court justice in who's pro-choice, or you can vote for Trump, who will put in a conservative Supreme Court justice. Do you identify with him? His, Acts 2 thing at, was it Liberty University, right, clearly outed him as not a part of the evangelical, that he doesn't identify with evangelicals, but seeing it as a strategic choice, right? Much like I think Hillary's campaign tried to say, really, you vote for that person over somebody who's stable, who you trust with the nuclear codes, right? I mean, those, and so that's part of the strange attractor notion, is that for different reasons, a lot of people came to Trump, still a minority. And you're right, we did talk mostly about one segment of that, so that was a great point.
Thanks.
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, all of the sort of post-election, let's go out into Red America and analyze what they were really thinking. I mean, there's all those pieces are their own genre now, right? They're a dime a dozen. But what they all show, or I mean, to me, the message that comes over time and time again is the idea that it's not a problem it's not a question of false consciousness. It's a question of, I know Trump's a jerk. I heard him say this, and he seemed like I didn't agree with it, or I did this right. So it's not like they're oblivious to things and that they needed the Clinton campaign to point it all out. So like Joel says, there are other things that are motivating them. So ideologically, I think it's a challenge that progressives have to say, okay, what we need to do is we need to replace your faulty beliefs with the correct ones, and then they're going to vote the right way.
That's a big ask.
Yeah. I mean, the phrase I always keep coming back to is, I know, but yet I do. In other words, I know better, but yet I act in ways. Like for me, it's the climate change issue, right? People know stuff, but yet we all continue to act in ways that exacerbate the climate problem. So simply sort of trying to replace, wrong beliefs with the right ones is not necessarily going to be the path to go. I think Sarah's saying there are other priorities. Joel's saying like it's the Supreme Court thing was the main issue. We've got to figure out what are those other issues that might be tapped into, rather than just trying to say you have to believe the same thing that I do. I mean, that doesn't seem to me like a big tent approach to developing political power. Is saying there has to be this litmus test that all of you that are in the party have to believe the same thing.
Well, I have a friend who's been a friend for 20 years, and she's very Christian, very pro-life. And I was canvassing a few years ago, and I was up on Horseback Ridge, Blue Mountain area, and I was really surprised that I was going to her house because I knew that they were, really right-wing Christians, and but all their kids voted Democratic. And that was a real shocker because they, usually kind of stay with the way they're, And I was messaging with her on Facebook one day right after the election, and I just had to say, I have to ask you, did you vote for Trump? And she said, well, I'll be honest. All she's got a daughter who's 34, just became a doctor. All of her kids, 5 kids, voted for Hillary. And she voted for Trump. And she said, we'll have to go out and have lunch sometime and talk about it. And I haven't been able to bring myself to do that because I know it's the whole abortion issue. And that's what it was for a lot of people. And I don't know how to get beyond that issue with, those people. Because that's it for a lot of them. And, we're still fighting this thing 40 years after. And, it's like the picture of the woman, who's in her 80s saying, I'm still protesting this shit. It's insane. But tomorrow's going to be a big deal, the march, because I bet there's going to be 10,000 people there. The latest number is 5, and I won't be surprised. And it's what happens after that. And this communication thing is, it's like my husband signed up for the Twitter, for Trump's Twitter, and I said, why are you doing that? And he said, well, I want to know what he's saying. And I'm like, no, that's feeding right into it. And his speech today was just sick.
I'm happy to say that I was here working on technology and didn't listen to his speech. But just going back to the abortion issue, it is one that I studied. One of the things I think we can think about, again, is in terms of reframing. And women of color have talked about not pro-choice and abortion rights, but instead reproductive justice and reproductive rights. And this is particularly powerful in an African American community where you have a lot of people who are, very strong Christians. They are anti-choice, but they also understand that reproductive rights is a bigger issue, right? It's related to, for African Americans, sterilization abuse. It's related to access to health care. It's related to access to insurance, as Joel was talking about. And so we can talk about sort of it as a bigger issue, and abortion, right? We can say, well, we'll agree to disagree because frankly, we probably will never agree about this, but let's reframe it, right? And I agree with Steve that framing is not everything, but I'm sorry, I study communication. I think framing is very powerful. So that's just one little piece in response to that particular issue.
I have a family who goes across that divide, and we don't talk politics, we don't speak about religion together when we're together, and instead it's kind of an honoring that there may be differences, but finding common ground. And I know Hein Perlman, and who's the co-author?
Lucy Albrecht Titeka.
Yeah, they talk about common ground, that you can never build connectedness or coalition in arguments without finding where that common ground moment is. Right? I think about the moment of teaching a gender and communication course at Texas A&M when I was there, and having women and gender studies students who were very proactive about reproductive justice and rights, along with several students who said, I could never marry a woman who would not take my name because that doesn't show proper biblical deference. Right? And together in a classroom and finding ways to sort of unpack beliefs and thoughts to a point to find common ground. Not that they end up in agreement, but to at least maintain a notion of civility and discussion across those boundaries. Does that make sense?
And I think sort of related to that has to do with, again, sort of the one of the big challenges of Trump's rhetoric is talking about people who don't agree with us as enemies, right? Which is part of the piece I was talking about. And we really need to avoid that. And talking about, again, that's what we can do by finding common ground. We might not agree with one another about this particular issue, but we have a certain, value system that we are all Americans, right? And what does that mean, and how can we come together around that?
Yeah, and I think Trump gets a little more latitude with that celebrity part when he brought that up, Steve. I thought of, what's he known for? You're fired. You're horrible, right? As a celebrity. And that I think he gets a lot more latitude to be that person than other people do, but I do think stepping out and naming that, at the same time he's talking about losers, take that, basically, in tweets. Some of his supporters will go out and say, I don't know why people aren't rallying behind the president. It's like, whoa, let's put this in context, right? First, with all of this that's been said, we're the ones that aren't rallying and unifying, and stepping back. I think that's a big part of what we need to do, or, people need to do.
I have a question. We've maybe had two very interesting, but maybe not necessarily positive for our purposes, communication styles. Yeah, we had Bernie Sanders running, and in fact, what just came to mind what Sue had said is that he went to Liberty University. I remember listening to that speech, the whole deal, and I was very impressed by that. What is his campaign, his primary campaign, maybe offer us in terms of a positive way forward, do you think?
Both look at me.
And it's-
All right,
yeah,
I'm looking
I'll
at
throw
Steve.
something out there. I mean, and somewhat related to prior comments. Some scholars in our field want to make a distinction between protest and dissent. Oftentimes we think about those as being the same thing, but you can think about the rhetoric of protest as the saying no portion, right? And that's a necessary tactic, rhetorical tactic that you need to use. Dissent you can think of as a little bit different, as both a saying no and a saying yes. So the challenge, right, in being able to participate in your culture is being able to say yes to something, right? Here is what we are for. Here is what we share as a shared value, or a common institution, or a set of norms that we're committed to, while at the same time disagreeing on some matter of substance or policy. So I think keeping that distinction in mind maybe one way of thinking about what Sanders is up to. What are the things that he is saying yes to? What are the norms and values that he's articulating to try and establish common ground? But also, what is he dissenting against? What is he opposing? And I think being able to keep both of those moments in mind is necessary for productively moving forward.
I may end up being a fly in the ointment on my comment here, but for me, Trump isn't anything weird at all. Okay? Everything you pointed out up there, at some degree or another, has been a continuous message from and I'm going to use some examples, and I don't want to give you the impression that I think it's all a racial thing, but some of the examples that I'm going to use were based on racial animosity. From the days of welfare queens to Willie Horton to the end of welfare as we know it, Mr. Clinton, across the whole spectrum, Tea Party, we're going to take our country back, These are not new ideas. And Trump was just a really smart, clever little to figure that out just enough to get elected in a political system that's broken. And that system is broken in the sense that people like us in this room with progressive values have no way of getting that message out in a really impactful way to the degree that we can win an election today. It's not there. Bernie Sanders, let me go and then. Bernie Sanders took a run at it, but I think his candidacy, despite all these tactical and, you know, ideas about how to reframe and all this stuff, he just couldn't get the coverage, the reach, because it was denied to him. It's a big, long-term problem of neoliberal, oligarchical control of this country and the whole process. And until we figure out a way to reverse that, we can debate all we want, what Trump did and this and that. But we're not going to get rid of the Trumps of the world until we can get a grip on this thing. And I don't know what the answer is, but my question to you is, what do you think of that? I mean, am I crazy or not? I mean,
I think if you had asked the Republican candidates that weren't Trump, they would agree that this was kind of an unintended consequence of that history of that rhetoric that they were able to capitalize on, yet be part of what is considered an establishment.
Right.
You know, and in some way, I mean, I don't have deep knowledge of the workings of the Democratic Party, but my guess is that there were Republicans who were kind of wishing they had superdelegates, you know, at least people who are running against Trump in the primaries, you know, and I think you're right. I think it builds a lot on hate, and that a lot of that has come together as a part of it. And then he became the candidate, so the establishment people are saying, it's better than Hillary, right? And you have other people who are finally somebody who's an outsider, and this will be different. And yeah, it's an interesting, complex process.
It was more of a failure than a win. I mean, truly.
For both parties.
Well, I mean, it was a failure on the side of his opponents, across even Hillary Clinton and her campaign and the Democratic Party. They failed more than he won,
big time.
in my opinion.
I agree with you. I agree with the first part of your statement, what Joel was just affirming as well. Certainly, this is a culmination of a long history of events that led to the possibility of electing Trump. What I push back at it a little bit is I don't think we should discount how well Bernie did. In the face of an entrenched democratic system where Hillary was going to be coronated, he really did something, and it suggests to me that perhaps, you know, we can. There is an opening here, right? So, and maybe I just have to be optimistic, or else I just go home and drink more of that Irish whiskey.
Oh, that bottle's empty. We know it. I didn't make it back.
Lynn.
To follow up on what you said, statistically, it actually was somewhat more of a failure on the part of the Democrats because Trump barely turned out any more voters than McCain or Romney. He basically just held onto the base, gathered a few stragglers. What happened was that there were hundreds of thousands or millions of voters that turned out for Obama, that did not turn out for Hillary. Perhaps this entire election is just an anomaly. But yeah, I would like to hear about, it seems to me that the thing that has captured at least Democrats and progressives, that has been able to capture their imagination in terms of the presidential election has been a positive feeling of something that we were going to accomplish together. And this goes back to 1992 when Bill Clinton won. His message, I mean, as horrendous as many things that Larry Happer's administration was, there was still a sense of capturing is that we too could have that shining city on the hill. There was an uplift to the rhetoric for that. I mean, certainly Obama was a master of that. I think Bernie was able to harness a lot of that feeling of uplift while still like really remaining grounded in policy. And I don't know what you guys think about that, but it seems to me that what we really need to focus on is not, oh my God, how could people vote for Trump? People vote for Trump against the Republican base, and that's really close to it. The real question to me is how do we turn out the other 2/3 of the country that we just failed at somehow?
Yeah, and how well can, in 2 years, how can those elections tie those incumbent candidates to Trump for good and bad, in some districts?
I just heard
But
the guru rate
I don't
today
know.
was 32% on the radio, and of course polls vary, but, I mean, I think we don't have a huge fight to convince people that he's not acceptable. I think that's already established. We need to find out what can we say to people, what do we have to offer. Anyway, I feel like I'm stating something rather than asking a question. I'm actually trying to ask
Well, I
a
think-
question.
I think my guess is, at least speaking for myself, that the rest of this room knows more about politics than I do. So, individually, each person knows more about politics than I do. So that's cool.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
It's really important for us all to also acknowledge that victory, even though it was a minority victory, was not won on rhetoric. Were very real things that happened to prevent. I'm thinking specifically about the Voting Rights Act. That first year it was not enacted throughout the South. And we can't ignore that. That's serious. There were tons of people who were disenfranchised who never even had an opportunity to respond to it on a measurable scale. So, I think it's really important to acknowledge the rhetoric, but I think it's also really important to listen to those disenfranchised communities and say, there's very real stuff we can organize around to make sure that your opportunity to respond is registered.
One quick one. To be hopeful, do you think that there are lessons in what we can expect and a path going forward from Tony Abbott and Berlusconi, who had similar appeal?
I'll defer to my political global ignorance on that, and say I
You were
think
an Aggie,
possibly.
sorry.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. I'm not an Aggie. I just taught there, and I escaped from Texas to Montana. So I don't know.
I don't know, yeah.
I think,
It's an interesting question. It would be interesting to explore.
and I've asked some poli-sci people that I know, because I remember back in the day reading stuff by, the name that clicks is Eric Fromm, who talks about social pathological periods or dark periods that societies go through based on nationalism and identity.
Man's search for meaning?
Well, yeah, he was really trying to explain Nazi Germany.
Right.
Right. And I've forgotten way more of that than I remember, but that there are nationalistic tendencies, and there are scholars who talk about how that's connected to the tribalism. As much as I dislike that term, being the father of an African American child, right? That isolation and sense of being imposed upon that was present then is also one of the outcomes of globalization, right? Is a perceived nationalistic tendency. I don't know. Maybe that's true.
This kind of parts it wasn't just what's happening out in their lives, but is it a possibility that because of Facebook and all the social media and how really rank it is, how very, very negative it is, that it's actually that could be affecting the people rather than what the people are feeling being collectively.
Yes.
Do you understand my question? Which came first there? The people voting for Trump or
mean, part of it comes back to when Sarah's talking about polarization. There's certainly been a fair amount of scholarship on the way that social media platforms in particular tend to reinforce your existing beliefs, how it's easy to get into, your Facebook feed. I mean, mine is no different than most people's. You tend to get a repetitive messages, and I think you get into an echo chamber or a bubble of thinking that, well, everybody else must feel the same way that I do. And I think that gets to why a lot of people saw this as a cosmology episode. So, I mean, to me, I think certainly from a social media perspective, that's something that fuels this, fuels the polarization. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
I'm just going to say one more thing to that. I think it's easier now than ever to kind of silence voices you don't like, to unfriend someone who doesn't take the same beliefs as you, or unfollow, or there's so many options for where you're getting your information as well. I mean, I try to engage in good conversations with friends that I've had for like up to 10 years that were expressing that they were supporting Trump, and I got defriended all over the place, even when I was trying to come from it like in a really good way. And so I just think it's easier now than ever to just be like, I don't care about your opinion, so I'm gonna delete you from my life.
We have time for 2 more questions. This gentleman here, and then the cameraman. Go ahead.
So I've been seeing like a big theme of feedback loops. Twitter is really easy to get your handle on because it's demands simplicity. There's also in turn, great impulsivity. Back in the welfare queens, these things are occurring. How do we use communication to break out of that and maybe reach out to the people that didn't show up? Do we need to use more emotion and values? Because I think progressives are really good on facts and reason, and we pride ourselves on that, but that just other people to see. So how can we kind of change our tactics for communication or engage those other people?
I think one of the things you write about progressives and facts, and to go back to Ronald Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan told great stories, and in '84, Walter Mondale tried to respond with facts, and he was the Teflon president, right? What's going to work is telling a story, telling an alternate story, and it can't be completely disconnected from the story that's being told. The story it resonates for a reason. And so we need to figure out why it resonates with the group of people to whom it resonates. And then we have to sort of also offer a story. And this is linked again to Lakoff, who talks about sort of that the stories and morals go hand in hand, right? So I think that's one of the things I would suggest. Yeah.
I think tying it to emotions, but also, as humans, we have that capacity to reflect. We have reflexivity. We can look at something that's happened, step outside of it, name it, and talk about it. And I think instead of digging in the trenches and just responding message to message, is stepping outside of that and naming that collectively like I talked about before. But I think you're exactly right that you also have to have emotion and connection. The tweets are talk, not action, right? Hate destroys our country, or it's not patriotic. Patriotism will shield us, or anyone who allows patriotism in their heart, what was it today, is immune from discrimination or prejudice. That's right. So if you let patriotism in your heart, you can't be prejudiced. Was one of the phrases that came out of his speech today. And that's a difficult thing to respond to because it's simplistic, it's emotional. You can't just go against patriotism, right? And so it's tricky, right? It becomes very tricky to set that aside, name what it is, and then come up with something that's counter to that, right?
This is like the $64,000 question in climate change communication, right? Is that, scientists have been running the show for 30 years trying to communicate about climate change, and it's like, no wonder the progress is as limited as it's been. The problem is then people think, okay, what we need is emotions as the counterbalance to that, right? Well, clearly whoever is advocating that did not read their Aristotle, the king daddy of rhetoric, okay? Because there's 3 modes of appeal. There's logos, facts and reasoning. There's pathos, emotional appeals. But then there's also ethos, which is credibility and character. Okay? Now, we can say whatever we want about Trump's character, but if we want to think about it in our own context, the question is, who are the messengers? Aristotle says, when opinions are divided and the facts are not clear, we tend to trust the people, we tend to defer to the opinions of those whom we trust. So the question is not only what's the right message or what are the right morals, but who is your messenger? Okay? Then this was like the big debate after Inconvenient Truth about, is Gore the right messenger for talking about climate change? Arguably, he's a flawed messenger, right? So I think this gets to the whole, red state, blue state divide, the whole, coastal versus the quote-unquote heart of America divide. Progressives need to start thinking about who are the other messengers that we might lift up, that we might create, that we might train, as the right has been doing for 40 years, to disseminate a broader message, to build communication networks in communities where maybe progressives are not quite as vocal or quite as strong as we would like them to be. So I think part of it is not just message, but also messengers.
Last question.
So, based on everything that you presented today, what advice would you guys have for the future, each of you? Based on everything that you just were talking about today.
New messengers.
Good question. Keep working. Keep moving forward.
I think stepping back and thinking about why does it feel that you're you're in your control? Why is it so complex? Name that and then answer that directly.
All right. Thank you very much. Right, and there's more workshops. I think after this one is about how to change the Democratic Party, which I think would be of interest following this. And there are other sites, and if you need more information about other workshops the rest of the day, come up and see me.